What happens when privilege collides with justice? Watch as an arrogant socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and learns a life lesson she'll never forget. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs that Saturday morning as people shuffled into their seats, preparing for what was to be a typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse. But today there was one detail that made this session different from the rest. The hearing was expected to draw attention because Tiffany Halstead, a socialite notorious for her reckless behavior and an inflated sense of entitlement, was about to face Judge William Grant. Judge Grant, known for his unshakable demeanor and sharp intellect, had earned the respect of the entire legal community. A fair but no-nonsense arbiter of justice, his reputation preceded him. He was the kind of judge who didn't tolerate arrogance or disregard for the law. Tiffany arrived fashionably late, as always. Draped in designer labels and oversized sunglasses, she strolled into the room like she was walking down a red carpet, unaware or unconcerned by the effect she was having. Her lawyer trailed behind her, visibly uncomfortable, attempting to minimize the scene as much as he could. The courtroom, accustomed to decorum, fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. She came to a stop in the middle of the aisle, completely oblivious to the people waiting for her to take a seat. With a dismissive wave, Tiffany motioned for her lawyer to move aside so she could set her bag down on the bench. She took off her sunglasses with exaggerated flair, glancing around as if she were royalty and the proceedings beneath her. The air in the room shifted when Judge Grant entered, his tall frame and calm authority filling the space. "Lizzie Marias," the bailiff called out. Tiffany hesitated for a moment before standing, sighing heavily. Her expression said it all. "Why am I even here?" But Judge Grant was unfazed. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file in front of him, and began the proceedings. Her case was simple. A series of parking violations, compounded by reckless driving that had endangered a pedestrian. But this wouldn't be just another routine hearing. Tiffany's arrogance would soon challenge that. As Judge Grant began outlining the charges, Tiffany leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes. Her blatant disrespect didn't go unnoticed, but Judge Grant carried on with his calm professionalism, his voice steady and measured. He didn't flinch or give her the attention she seemed to crave. Instead, it was as if he was daring her to continue testing him. The tension in the room built, but Tiffany was oblivious. She tapped her manicured nails loudly against the table, signaling her growing impatience. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something urgently, but Tiffany waved him off dismissively. When Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity, Tiffany barely glanced up. "Yeah, that's me," she said indifferently, her tone dripping with sarcasm. A collective murmur rippled through the room, but Judge Grant didn't let her attitude faze him. His eyes remained focused on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice calm yet firm, "in this courtroom we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, clearly amused. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice laced with mockery. A few gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. But Judge Grant was unshaken. "Miss Halstead," he said once more, his voice commanding, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, audibly sighing. "Honestly, no. I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets and what, someone getting scared because I hit the gas too hard? This is a waste of time." The room fell silent. All eyes were now fixed on Judge Grant, who slowly closed the file in front of him. He deliberately removed his glasses and placed them on the bench. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." The gravity of Judge Grant's tone caused even the most disinterested court spectators to sit up, but Tiffany, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, simply shrugged. "What? It's true," she said, leaning forward this time. "It's not like I hurt anyone." But what Tiffany failed to realize was that her words were no longer falling on deaf ears. Judge Grant's silence spoke volumes, and the courtroom was about to witness a response they would never forget. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze fixed on Tiffany. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Even Tiffany's lawyer, who had been nervously shuffling papers, stopped to glance at the judge. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone steady, almost conversational. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was impossible to ignore. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as though brushing away an imaginary nuisance. Judge Grant nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. "I see," he said. His calm demeanor only heightened the suspense, making the spectators edge closer to the edge of their seats. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead." He leaned in slightly, and Tiffany's smug expression faltered. "The charges against you include not only reckless driving but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime but by its impact. Do you understand that?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, muttering under her breath, "Sure, sure, whatever you say." Her whisper was soft, but it carried through the silence in the courtroom. The judge's face remained composed, but there was a shift, a slight narrowing of his eyes, that signaled something was about to change. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant began again, his voice still calm but now carrying more weight. "Do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago, the one that brought you here today?" Sir." Tiffany shrugged, looking bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb, I honked, he moved. End of story." The judge raised his eyebrows. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she said, crossing her arms. "No harm, no foul." But Judge Grant wasn't finished. He reached for a document on the bench, flipping through it with measured precision. Then he addressed the courtroom. "Let the record show," he said, his voice carrying authority, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, was a 67-year-old retired teacher. He was crossing the street legally when Miss Halstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain." Tiffany's smirk faltered for the first time. She glanced at her lawyer, who whispered something to her, but she waved him off again. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He was fine." "Ms. Halstead," Judge Grant continued, now directing his full attention back to her, "does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Before Tiffany could open her mouth to reply, Judge Grant's next move made it abundantly clear that her actions had far-reaching consequences she could no longer ignore. Judge Grant's steady gaze remained fixed on Tiffany, his voice measured as he continued. "Miss Halstead, your perspective on this matter is troubling, not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the weight of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, feigning nonchalance. But the growing tension in the room was impossible to miss. "Look, I said I didn't hit him," Tiffany muttered. "People are so dramatic these days." The comment elicited gasps from the courtroom gallery. Judge Grant tapped his pen lightly against the desk, pausing for a moment before speaking again. "Dramatic," he repeated, his tone still even. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Halstead? Because he's here today in this courtroom." The air grew thick with anticipation. Tiffany's confident facade wavered. Her eyes darted briefly toward the gallery. There, sitting quietly in the second row, was Mr. Lopez. His arm in a sling, his weathered face showed no anger, only a kind of quiet disappointment that seemed to cut deeper than any harsh words could. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but her defiance wasn't entirely gone. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, though her voice lacked its earlier bravado. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding the room. "Miss Halstead, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability." The courtroom was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen could be heard. All eyes were on Judge Grant now, waiting to see what he would do next. Then, with a calm that belied the weight of his words, he said, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked, her earlier bravado crumbling. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine worry for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the bailiff, who handed him a small stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing the fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training Tiffany would need to complete. But it wasn't the penalties themselves that made the biggest impact. It was the way he delivered them, weaving in a powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. Tiffany's smirk faltered as the reality of the situation began to sink in, but what truly shook her, and the entire courtroom, was the unexpected final decision. Judge Grant set the papers down, his gaze steady and unwavering. The weight of his next words seemed to fill the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice even but carrying immense gravity, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with a much-needed perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her earlier flippancy replaced by a flicker of unease. "Perspective?" she echoed, her voice edged with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant said firmly. "In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." A collective murmur spread through the room. This wasn't the typical sentence one expected in a case like this, and the crowd's mixed reactions were palpable. Some nodded in approval, others exchanged incredulous glances, but the most telling reaction came from Tiffany herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's face didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "Miss Halstead, it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect those around you. This is not a punishment, it is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she yanked her arm away. "This is insane. You can't force me to do this." Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst. "Ms. Halstead, this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. Should you fail to cooperate, I will see you back in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room was silent again, the weight of Judge Grant's words hanging heavily in the air. Tiffany's face flushed with anger, but for once she said nothing. She simply sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impression, not just on Tiffany, but on everyone in the room. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor unshaken despite Tiffany's visible defiance. He let the silence stretch for a moment, ensuring his next words would land with full force. "Miss Halstead," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long, and that has cost you the ability to empathize. This is not about punishment. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the gallery. Her bravado slipping further, she opened her mouth as if to speak, but seemed to think better of it. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about his feelings toward you?" Judge Grant asked, his voice softer now, almost conversational. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes darting to Mr. Lopez, who remained seated in the gallery. His expression was still one of quiet disappointment. "Said," Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand, because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people, and one day it might be something she can't undo." The words landed like a hammer. Tiffany's face turned pale, her usual composure unraveling. For the first time, her defiance gave way to something else. Discomfort, perhaps even guilt. Judge Grant didn't let up. "Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured has chosen grace over anger. He could have pressed for harsher penalties, but he asked for something different. An opportunity for you to learn. That's what this sentence represents." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her confidence eroded. The room was so quiet that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, seemed amplified. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning," Judge Grant continued. "There you'll meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Some are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and accountability." Tiffany looked as though she wanted to protest, but the weight of the moment seemed to hold her tongue. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, signaling for her to stay quiet. But even as the judge's words began to sink in, the real transformation would only begin once Tiffany faced the realities waiting for her outside the sheltered bubble of her privilege. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant announced, his voice firm as he rose from his seat and exited the courtroom. The tension in the room seemed to linger like a storm that had just passed but left its mark. Tiffany remained seated, her face a mixture of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly, but she barely acknowledged him. The gallery began to empty, the murmurs of the onlookers rising as people discussed what they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his arm in a sling, a stark reminder of the incident that had brought them all here. He glanced at Tiffany as he passed, his expression still kind but resolute. She avoided his gaze, staring instead at the table in front of her. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. Tiffany's name, already a headline for her socialite antics, was now linked to a moment of courtroom drama that had captivated everyone in attendance. Cameras flashed as she emerged, flanked by her lawyer, who shielded her from the barrage of questions. "Miss Halstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing?" one reporter called out. "Do you feel the sentence was fair? What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision?" Tiffany's usual arrogance resurfaced for a moment. "No comment," she snapped, pushing past the crowd and into the waiting car. But inside, the facade began to crack. As the doors closed and the noise of the reporters faded, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, it seemed reality was setting in. That evening, the story was the top headline across news outlets. Clips from the courtroom, including Judge Grant's powerful words, went viral, sparking widespread discussion. Social media lit up with opinions, some praising the judge's decision, others criticizing Tiffany's behavior. But the most poignant commentary came from Mr. Lopez, who gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. "I don't want her to fail," he said. "I just hope she learns, because when we stop learning, we stop growing. And that's when we truly lose." The simplicity of his words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. For Tiffany, though, the lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, and with it, a world far removed from her designer handbags and privileged lifestyle. But what Tiffany would soon discover was that real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing, from doing, and from feeling the weight of someone else's reality. Monday arrived with an unfamiliar chill for Tiffany, both in the air and in her chest. She stood outside the downtown women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses hiding the hesitation in her eyes. The building was modest, bustling with activity as volunteers and staff hurried about. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany felt out of place. As she stepped inside, the warm hum of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils greeted her. A staff member, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "Welcome. Let's get you started." The hours passed, slowly at first. Tiffany was assigned to help prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. She didn't speak much, keeping her head down, her usual bravado stripped away. But as the day wore on, she began to notice things she hadn't before. The gratitude in the smiles of the shelter's guests, the camaraderie among the staff, and the resilience in the stories she overheard. One woman, a single mother of 3, shared her struggles with Tiffany over lunch. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of hardship. "You think you've got it all figured out," she said, her eyes meeting Tiffany's. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." That night, as Tiffany drove home, her thoughts were uncharacteristically quiet. The faces of the people she'd met lingered in her mind, along with Judge Grant's words. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to life than the world she had built for herself, a world of privilege, isolation, and superficiality. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany's mandatory service continued. Day by day, the walls she had built around herself began to crack. She listened more, spoke less, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to change. By the time her sentence was complete, Tiffany stood before Judge Grant once more, this time a quieter, more introspective version of herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his face softening just slightly. "The real thanks will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, she carried a small but powerful hope. A chance to rebuild not just her life, but her perspective. And so Tiffany's journey became a reminder to everyone that change is possible, but it takes humility, courage, and the willingness to confront one's flaws. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life has to teach? As Tiffany left the courthouse, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow over her, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a chance to redefine her life, her values, and the world she had built for herself. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the old arrogance tried to creep back in, when the lessons learned seemed distant. But Tiffany had taken the first step, and that was enough to begin a transformation she had never imagined possible. She had started to see the world outside her bubble, one where privilege didn't blind her to the realities others faced. She could change, and perhaps, in time, become a voice for those she had once dismissed. As she walked away from the courthouse, Tiffany knew her story wasn't finished yet. It was just the beginning of a longer journey, one of growth, understanding, and purpose. And while she couldn't undo the past, she could build a future rooted in humility, respect, and accountability. For Tiffany, this wasn't just a sentence, it was a wake-up call, a chance to learn and grow, to listen and act. It wasn't about the mistakes she had made, but what she would do with the lessons learned. And in that moment, she promised herself that no matter how hard it might get, she would rise above, stronger, and more aware of the world around her. As she drove away, Tiffany's heart was lighter than it had been in years. She had learned something that would stay with her forever, that true growth comes not from the things you achieve, but from the willingness to change, to admit your flaws and to use those lessons to help others. And, in that moment, she was finally ready to begin.